a multipolar world, you have to compete on what you offer, not on what you threaten to take away.
Most empires, when they're in their stage of decline, is when they're the most violent.
The Western Hemisphere is now trying to contain the US.
They can't go through it. It would literally lead to a collapse of European society.
So they're stuck.
If and when the US tries to contain China, the end result is that it contains itself.
Welcome everyone to this very special panel discussion here in Chongqing, China. We are here to discuss what may very well be one of the most important topics of our time. We find ourselves moving away from a unipolar powered world into a multipolar one, a profound realignment of power that brings both opportunities and challenges. We will get to explore two very different perspectives on what the main priorities are for the powers involved in this shift. I'm Daniel Dumbrill, your host and panel moderator for today. First off, this event would not have been possible without the sponsorship and support provided by a team of talented individuals at the Western China International Communication Organization. They worked tirelessly to bring my idea to life. So first off, a very big thank you to our sponsor. Thank you also to our friends in the studio audience who have made their way out here this morning to join us for this discussion. To discuss today's topic, I'm thrilled to be joined by two distinguished experts and longtime friends of mine. They'll deliver keynotes followed by an open discussion and, of course, questions from the audience. First, Arnaud Bertrand, a French national who has flown in from Malaysia to share his perspective, an accomplished entrepreneur who sold one of his companies to TripAdvisor and is a very influential analyst and author on geopolitics with a massive following on X, which includes global leaders like the presidents of El Salvador, Chile, Rwanda, and beyond. Arnaud's keynote is titled From Unipolar Ambitions to Multipolar Survival, the U.S. Shift Towards Economic Coexistence. Next, we have Ben Norton, who has flown in from Beijing, where he's well into his PhD program at Tsinghua University. Ben is the founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. He's a well-known longtime journalist and geopolitical commentator with over 1 million subscribers across multiple platforms. Ben will offer a counter-perspective with his keynote titled Beyond Rhetoric, Why U.S. Coexistence with China Masks a Containment Agenda. This will be particularly interesting because Ben and Arnaud agree on almost everything, but on the question of coexistence, they have two very different perspectives. And I can't wait to jump in and explore those differences. So without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome, Ben and Arnaud.
Thank you, Daniel. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having me and thanks for organizing this.
Absolutely. This is going to be really exciting. And of course, we have your keynotes, which we're really looking forward to. But before that, let's warm up with a question which I think you'll have a similar opinion on, but we'll see. So regardless if you believe that China is still being contained by the US or that this is a primary policy of the US, do you think it's even possible for the US to contain China anymore, even if that were their goal? Ben, let's start with you.
As I'll show today, I certainly think the US would like to contain China, but at this point, I do not think it's possible. Maybe it could have been possible 20 years ago, but I think that ship has definitely sailed. And today, what the US is going to try to do is to minimize China's development economically and technologically, but there's no way it will succeed, in my view.
So 20 years ago, if they could have seen what China would have become today, they probably would have used that window of opportunity more at that point.
Well, this is what many US officials have been saying, not only Republicans, but even some Democrats. But we see top US officials say they should never have allowed China to join the World Trade Organization, that it was a mistake to engage with China and have lots of trade. So certainly that's what they're saying, but like I said, at this point, I think it's much too late. And also, it's not just a matter of the US, like the people of China are not going to allow a foreign country to prevent them from developing.
Right. Arnaud, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. In fact, I will go one step further. I think today what we're seeing is that if and when the US tries to contain China, the end result is that it contains itself. Like we've seen multiple examples of that, like with the latest renewal of the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. What it's trying to do is to sort of throw China out of its hemisphere. But countries, the way they're reacting, like we just saw with Canada, I mean, Mark Carney, the Canadian PM was just here. On the contrary, they're shifting and they're engaging more with China at the expense of the US. So it's completely counterproductive.
Yeah, they're almost accelerating the multipolarity that they want to avoid.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into your keynote. So how about we start with your keynote on coexistence and multipolarity?
Let's go.
All right.
Yeah, okay. So as China's leadership often says, we're witnessing great changes unseen in a century. So today my talk will focus specifically on how the US is changing, and I will make two arguments: that the US now recognizes the reality of a multipolar world, and that by definition it means that the US has moved on from a position where it sees itself as a global hegemon to one where it sees itself as a pole amongst others. As you say in Latin, primus inter pares, first among equals. And second, I will argue that regarding China specifically, the US is reluctantly moving from active containment towards coexistence. So let me start with the definition. What does multipolarity actually mean? It means a world with several great powers where no single power can impose its will on the others. That's the key test, not whether you're powerful, but whether you can make others comply when they don't want to. So let's apply that test to America and China. So as we all remember, in April 2025, Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, and China retaliated hard. And the result is that Washington settles for tariffs lower on China than for many of its traditional allies, like us Europeans. Or you have another example in September 2025. That's been less talked about, but the US tried implementing something called the BIS 50% rule, which actually expanded sanctions on Chinese companies 20-fold. It's increased the number of Chinese sanctioned companies from roughly 1,300 companies to over 20,000. So that was a huge action by the US to contain Chinese companies. And what did China do? They responded with their rare earth export controls. We all remember the rare earth export controls that China introduced. That was for this reason. And the end result, again, is that Washington panicked and ended up completely suspending the BIS 50% rules in Busan, in South Korea, during the summit with President Xi. So that's two major containment initiatives within 8 months, and both failed. Both had to be walked back, precisely because China can now hit back just as hard on the US. So when you consistently fail to impose your will on another power, it means you can't, by definition, and that's the very definition of multipolarity. And to be fair, the US explicitly recognizes this reality. If you read their new national security strategy, they call, for the first time ever, they call global hegemony fundamentally undesirable and impossible goal. That is the exact wording in the national security strategy. So notice that in that sentence, there are two distinct claims: that hegemony is undesirable, which is a judgment of value, and that it's impossible, which is a judgment of fact. Why undesirable? Because, to quote the national security strategy again, it's self-defeating. As they write, it hollowed out the very middle class and industrial base on which American economic and military preeminence depends. So what this concretely means is that they now view the pursuit of global hegemony as working against their economic and security interests. Same assessment from America's partners. Just last month, Germany's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, from CDU, which is traditionally the most pro-American party in German politics, he gave a speech where he said something quite extraordinary, given who he is. He said, Pax Americana no longer exists. He didn't say it's weakening. He didn't say it faces challenges. He says it no longer exists. And he added that and this is a quote again, "This course is not temporary. Trump did not appear overnight, and this policy will not disappear overnight either." So in other words, what he's saying is that this is structural. The old America is not coming back. Or take Canada. We were just speaking about that. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, was in China until yesterday, I think. And he declared here in China that we are now in a new world order. Those are his exact words, where Canada and China need to go into a strategic partnerships. Again, his words. This is Canada, America's next door neighbor, and one of its closest partners. And what does a new world order mean? It obviously implies that the previous world order, the one structured by US leadership, is over. Again, it means we are now in a multipolar world. But it's not just rhetoric from allies. Look at what allies are actually doing. So one thing that I found extraordinary last year was in September 2025, Saudi Arabia, which is arguably the poster child of US client states, they formed a NATO-like security alliance with Pakistan. This is the kingdom that has anchored American influence in the Middle East since Franklin D. Roosevelt met Ibn Saud in 1945. And they're now entering a formal military alliance outside of the US security umbrella with another nuclear state, which is Pakistan. Or check what's happening over Greenland right now. For the first time ever, you have US NATO allies positioning military forces to protect against the United States, which is incredible. So when your allies now see you as someone they need to protect themselves from, that's not hegemony anymore. That's just being one pole among others, one that your own partners now need to balance against, which is again the textbook definition of a multipolar world. You could also look at the military balance, which is the ultimate measure of relative power. And we now live in a world where China's Navy is twice as large as the entire US Navy in ship counts, where China has 47% more combat-capable fighter jets than the US, 1,100 fighters versus 750 for the US Air Force. Those aren't Chinese figures. They're from US defense institutions. John Venable at the Mitchell Institute said that the US Air Force quote, falls short, woefully short against China. And you have Secretary of Defense Axel, who admitted that in Pentagon war games against China, the US loses every time, which is, again, an actual quote. And according to the New York Times, the Pentagon itself is now producing a classified memo called the Overmatch Brief that tracks exactly what the title says, US military overmatch by China. And you could look at other dimensions of power, such as the fact that, according to Nature magazine, the world's preeminent science publication, China leads research in 90% of crucial technologies, what they call a dramatic shift this century. Think about how extraordinary this is. China now leads the US in 90% of crucial technologies. Or you could look at China's relative standing versus the US with respect to global share of manufacturing output, where China has 28% of the global share and the US is 17%. You could look at infrastructure, you could look at education, you could look at almost any dimension of power, and China is now at least on par with the US and often ahead. So that's the situation when your allies declare your era over, when you can't impose your will on rivals, when your military balance shows you have direct peer competitors, and when you yourself officially abandon hegemony as a doctrine. This is not tactics, this is structural. So if you're the US, an empire that has just recognized it can no longer impose its will globally, what do? You do what every overstretched power in history has done. You contract geographically, you prioritize strategically, and you make your commitments conditional rather than absolute. And that's precisely what we're seeing. So the Monroe Doctrine revival tells you everything. This is a 19th century policy from when America was a regional power, when it had regional ambitions because it lacked global capacity. For over a century, as American power grew, the doctrine became irrelevant. When you claim the entire world as your sphere of influence, your own hemisphere loses its special status. It's just part of your sphere of influence. So previous national security strategies never even mentioned it. The 2022 national security strategy spoke of a partnership with Latin America. The 2015 strategy celebrated diplomatic achievements in the region, but the 2025 strategy revised Monroe explicitly and frames the Western Hemisphere as the priority. The direct quote is, "After years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere." So when you resurrect a doctrine from your era as a regional power, what you're announcing is obvious. You are a regional power again. And in other regions, the burden shifting is explicit. Washington isn't saying we're making allies stronger. It's saying allies must step up because we just can't carry this ourselves anymore. That's what powers do when costs exceed benefits. There is even a specific deadline set by the Pentagon for Europe, which is 2027. By that year, Europeans must take over the majority of NATO's conventional defense. So the US now recognizes multipolar reality, not because it chose to, but because it has no choice. But recognizing reality and accepting it gracefully, two different things. Which brings me to my second argument, what this means specifically for US-China relations. Again, I have absolutely zero doubts that America wants to contain China. And of course it does. If they didn't, why would they have tried to do exactly that during the past 8 years? No, the question is rather whether it still can. Power is not about what you want to do, it's about what you can do. And that's the distinction we need to make. Not between good intentions and bad intentions, but between capability and will. So the question at play here isn't whether the US intends to contain China, but whether it has a choice in the matter. And my argument is that no, they don't. China has risen and has reached a stage where it's simply not containable anymore. It's over. In fact, I will go one step further and make a simple prediction, which is that the US won't even be able to contain China in their own hemisphere, in the Americas, and the more they try to do just that, the more counterproductive it will prove to be. Just look at the facts. They announced their new Monroe Doctrine with the explicit goal of winding down adversarial outside influence by non-hemispheric competitors. That is the exact wording in the national security strategy. And by non-hemispheric competitors, they obviously refer to China. And that was back in November, 2 months ago. 2 months afterwards, we now have Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, in Beijing, describing, in his own words, a new era of relations between Canada and China, and explicitly talking about both countries becoming strategic partners on a comprehensive range of issues, including issues on security. So there is no overstating how extraordinary this is to anyone who has followed Canada-China relations in the past few years. Canada was probably the country globally most aligned with the US when it comes to China. It's a G7 country, it's a Five Eyes country. There are no closer partners for the US. And as a reminder, Canada literally abducted the daughter of Huawei's founder, Meng Wanzhou, on the US behalf and held her hostage for several years, despite severe Chinese retaliation, all in service of Washington's containment strategy on China. So that's the irony. For all intents and purposes, Canada actually used to embody the Monroe Doctrine. In practice, they were all in on the US. And now, with this talk of Monroe Doctrine, Trump has achieved the extraordinary feat of changing that calculus, impressing upon Canada that he was the threat and that they needed to hedge their US exposure. So that's the contrary of the Western Hemisphere containing China. The Western Hemisphere is now trying to contain the US. Let's take another extremely telling example. Javier Milei in Argentina. So this is a man who is ideologically very close to Trump. He is Trump's self-described favorite president, and he is radically opposed to communism. Before getting elected, he swore, this is a direct quote from him, "Not only I will not do business with China, I won't do business with any communist." So that's his ideology. If there was one person who could be convinced to stop engaging with China in the entire Western Hemisphere, it must be him, right? And the US actually tried very hard to do just that. When Argentina's currency swap with China came up for renewal last year in April 2025, US Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent flew personally to Buenos Aires to pressure Milei to drop the currency swap agreement with China. He's actually quoted as saying, "What we want is for the famous credit line Argentina has with China to end." That's what he wanted. And the result is that Argentina renewed its Chinese currency swap, which now represents 43% of the country's gross reserves, the exact same month as Bessent's visit. And Milei went from saying he would never deal with communists to telling President Xi at the G20 that Argentina is a reliable and stable cooperative partner of China and that he firmly supports China's position on the Taiwan question. So even today, in the context of the new Monroe Doctrine, and even after receiving a $20 billion bailout by the US, which happened recently, Milei is planning a trip to China in 2026 and is saying, "I'm not going to break trade links with China. We have a very good commercial relationship with China. In fact, the United States has trade links with China as well." This is a quote from Milei from just last week. So this example is devastating. The US cannot contain China even in its own hemisphere, even with its most ideologically aligned partner, even when applying maximum diplomatic pressure on them, with the most senior US official flying personally to pressure Milei. So if you can't do it with Milei in Argentina, what possible hope do you have to convince anyone else? The reality is that it's sort of a question of value proposition. China offers commerce and development. They have $518 billion in bilateral trade with Latin America in 2024. They have free trade agreements and, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. China has surpassed the US as South America's largest trading partner. And a recent poll shows that most South American countries surveyed now view China as a more reliable trade partner than the US. Crucially, China's approach is based on choice. So it's trade. You have infrastructure for resources, market for commodities, capital without demands to restructure your politics or to sever ties with others. You can trade with Beijing and Washington at the same time. China doesn't ask for exclusivity. And the US answer is largely pressure tactics, coercion, or as we've seen recently in Venezuela, even military actions. That's not a very particularly appealing value proposition. Could it work? Well, in some cases, I'm sure it will. But structurally, it's self-defeating. You cannot use coercion to compete with mutual benefits. You cannot threaten countries into abandoning a $500 billion trading relationship into abandoning their largest trading partner. In fact, as we're seeing with Canada, the more you try, the more you push countries towards exactly what you fear. Coercion doesn't create loyalty, it creates hedging. And hedging, in that case, means China. At the end of the day, it's human. Will you stay with an abusive partner when you have somewhere else to go? The moment a credible alternative exists, coercion stops being control and starts being motivation to live. That's what the US is failing to understand. In a multipolar world, you have to compete on what you offer, not on what you threaten to take away. Hegemony lets you keep that part, lets you skip that part, but multipolarity doesn't. It's strange the US doesn't get that because that's precisely how they won during the Cold War. They were the attractive side, the side that people wanted to join. There was a sense that joining them meant a better life. As George Kennan, who was the architect of the US Cold War strategy, he wrote that the strategy was, and that's a direct quote, all about proving to the world that it was their side that was coping successfully with the problems of its internal life and with the responsibilities of a world power. Does it look like that today? No, it's almost the complete opposite. With China offering the kind of free trade commerce that the US once championed, and the US trying to wall itself off from the rest of the world. And history suggests that's not a winning formula. Ultimately, the US, even in its own hemisphere, is bound to understand that it cannot threaten countries into preferring them. At some point, you have to have the better offer, which means it will have to compete with China on actual value, on price, on quality, on reliability. Good luck with that. There is a saying in business, if your model requires outcompeting China on cost and quality, you don't have a model, you have a problem. So to conclude, I never argued that the US has become benign or that it's accepted China's rise gracefully. Washington will contain China tomorrow if it could. My point is containment that consistently fails isn't a strategy. You can maintain the infrastructure of containment all you want. If it doesn't produce containment, what do you actually have? What you have is a wish dressed up as a strategy and coexistence by another name. So the question isn't whether America wants coexistence, it doesn't. The question is whether America has a choice. And undoubtedly, the answer is no.
Thank you. That was a very compelling argument. And so I guess one of the key points is that they've tried. They've tried to contain China, but they've continually failed and even gone as far as conceding that it's not possible anymore.
No.
But the question is, so you say it's not a strategy, but potentially it could be just a bad strategy. So have they conceded to the point where containment of China is no longer their primary objective? Do you think that they've kind of retracted away from that a little bit? Or do you still think it remains one of their primary objectives that they're still going to try to do, even if it's futile?
I think it still remains one of their objectives, mostly in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, that's explicitly what's written in the National Security Strategy, to sort of wind down the influence of non-hemispheric countries in their hemisphere. But the example of Canada or Argentina that I gave in my talk are extremely telling. It's as they try to do that, of course, countries are going to freak out and actually try to hedge from that because they don't want that direct coercion by the US. So sooner or later, they're bound to recognize reality and even try to stop doing that in their own hemisphere.
But they haven't realized. They haven't come to terms with that yet. They haven't realized that they have to stop doing this. So they've given up on global hegemony, and they're pushing on a more localized, like you said, the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
But they haven't gotten to a point where they realize that this is counterproductive and they've changed their strategy as of yet.
In the Western Hemisphere, I don't think they're yet there, but it's either way for China it works because whether they stop containment in their own hemisphere, then containment is stopped. But if they keep doing it, then it's not containment. It's the opposite. It's the opposite of it. It goes so in practice, it's actually not containment. Right. That's my point. Yeah.
So they have though given up on containment of China on a more global scale.
Yeah.
And they just want to kind of control their own hemisphere and try to reduce China's ability to.
Even on a global scale, there are still some remnants of containment, especially in technologies, for instance. Although the Trump administration is actually slowly moving away from that, like we're seeing with semiconductors. So they're starting to allow some more high-end semiconductors to be sold to China. And the irony is that China doesn't want them anymore because it allowed them, and that's why they're shifting their strategy, because here again, containment was counterproductive. It turbo boosted China's domestic capabilities.
Yeah, and innovation.
So,
Right.
Again, here is an instance of containment being a strategy in words, but actually working in effect in the long run to contain the US themselves.
Right, right. And Ben, I guess your overall perspective isn't going to be that different. You may have some minor differences on how you look at certain things, but before we get into your keynote, which is going to give that different perspective, what stood out for you with Arnaud's keynote? What was the most kind of compelling argument for you?
Well, it was a great presentation, and I agree with most of it, actually. Yeah, I think we only have some slight disagreements on certain issues. Overall, I think we share a lot of views of the world, especially I think Arnaud made a very compelling argument about the strengths that China has, and that it's not a matter of, you said it's not a matter of intentions, it's a matter of capability. The US simply doesn't have the capability of containing China at this point. I strongly agree with that, and I agree with you that, in fact, in many ways, the more that the US attacks, it does backfire. We see this with things like export restrictions on chips. We see this with the tariffs on China, where it actually ended up hurting the US economy more, a point that I'll be making. I think one of the big differences that I'll be emphasizing is that I think when we're looking at a declining hegemon, a declining empire, oftentimes it engages in very irrational activities. Yeah. If you look, many empires, when they're in their declining phase, they are self-destructive. Everyone can see that with hindsight, and we can even see that today while it's happening, but that doesn't stop them from committing very destructive policies because they can see that they're going to decline regardless. And for them, the question is, well, if they're going to decline in the long term, should they at least try to go down fighting? And that's my real concern, is that I think we're going to see a massive acceleration of this US aggression in the years to come.
Right, then it gets worse from here. All right, with that, let's go right into your keynote.
Yeah, thank you. I think people will see that Arnaud and I agree on a lot of things, most things, but maybe we have a few points of difference. So today I'll be presenting, and my presentation, I created a presentation, and it's called Beyond Rhetoric, Why US Coexistence with China Masks a Containment Agenda. So I think it's important to begin this presentation today discussing this idea of Cold War II, or the Second Cold War. It's now widely acknowledged in Washington and even other parts of the world that we are in a new Cold War. This is a term that has been used even, for instance, here's an article from Foreign Affairs, which is a leading journal in the US. It's the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, probably the most important US foreign policy group. They say very clearly there is a second Cold War. Now, I should emphasize that Chinese leadership has been very adamant in that it does not want a new Cold War. Chinese officials frequently say that they oppose the Cold War mentality. So I want to be clear that this is being driven by the US. But if one side wants a new Cold War, unfortunately, it is a new Cold War. Now, this has led to a big debate about when exactly this started. And a lot of people will say that it goes back to the pivot to Asia that was announced by the Obama administration in 2011. And you could also go back even further. What's actually very interesting is in 1989, Deng Xiaoping gave a very interesting speech where he argued that the US was starting a new Cold War. And Deng said that new Cold War was against the global South. He said third world countries and also socialist countries. So you can see that even among Chinese leadership, there's been this acknowledgement going back decades that the US was seeking to contain China even right after the rapprochement with China in the 1970s. Now, my view is that the main reason for this is structural. It's not because of any individual leader, it's not because of Obama, it's not because of Trump. It's because the US has fears of losing its global hegemony. And we've been discussing how there's no question that the US has lost its global hegemony. And I think that it's going to fight really hard to try to regain that over a longer period. I mean, it might be in a strategic retreat now, but I think there's a larger strategy here. So this is a chart here showing GDP measured at purchasing power parity as a share of the global economy. So this accounts for the purchasing power of different currencies. The US dollar is very overvalued when you look at its purchasing power, whereas the yuan is a bit undervalued. So when you account for that, China actually now represents nearly 20% of the global economy, whereas the US is just over 14%. And you can see a clear trend over time. China's share of the global economy is rising, the US share is falling. And especially when you look at global manufacturing, China has become the world's manufacturing superpower. When you look at gross output, China represents about 1/3 of global manufacturing. And when you look at the next 9 largest manufacturing economies combined, China represents the same level of manufacturing output. So, I mean, from the perspective of policymakers in Washington who are seeking, dominance, especially economic dominance, this is what really keeps them up at night. And this is why I ultimately think that they will be incapable of containing China, because you cannot contain the largest economy in the world that's now the largest trading partner of most countries on Earth. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the rhetoric of the last 2 administrations, they've even acknowledged this rhetoric about a new Cold War, which, again, if you're in Washington, it's pretty widely discussed. They say we're in a new Cold War. US officials at the top level are not going to say this publicly for public relations reasons. As people say in Washington and around the world, politicians have a public-facing position and a private position, which are not the same. So Biden claimed in a speech at the UN in 2021 that the US is not seeking a Cold War or a world divide into rigid blocs. But then, in his 2022 State of the Union address, Biden claimed that there is a global, quote, battle between democracy and autocracy, end quote. Now, obviously, this is not the way that Trump and his administration sees the world, but it shows that, even while U.S. officials say they're not in a Cold War, they cannot help but avoid using this Cold War rhetoric. An even more revealing speech was in 2022 when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced essentially a containment policy. Blinken said this, quote, "We cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory, so we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing," end quote. What is shaping the strategic environment around a country? That's a euphemism for containment. And then Blinken said, quote, "The scale and the scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before," end quote. And there was a similar comment made by Marco Rubio, the current Secretary of State, when he was given his Senate confirmation hearing. And Rubio said basically the same. He said, "The People's Republic of China is the greatest challenge that the U.S. has ever faced," he said, "much greater than the Soviet Union." Now, in terms of the Trump administration, we know that in his first term, the Trump administration was extremely hawkish on China, especially Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director turned Secretary of State. In 2020, he gave a speech at the Richard Nixon Library, which was a symbolic decision because Nixon was the one who first normalized relations with China. And Pompeo said that China, quote, "threatens our people and our prosperity," end quote. And he said the U.S., quote, "must induce China to change in more creative and assertive ways," end quote. Now, it's true that in the second Trump administration, it seems like Trump is being a little more pragmatic. I think this is actually because the U.S. has no option. Trump started this unilateral trade war on China in his first term. We should emphasize that this is a trade war started by the U.S., not by China. And Biden actually continued a lot of these policies. Biden's tariffs against China were more targeted. They were not blanket tariffs, but he put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and very high tariffs on Chinese batteries and solar panels and other high-tech products. In his second term, Trump launched another extreme trade war on China, at one point threatening tariffs of 145%. But of course, this trade war failed, and the U.S. was forced into short-term strategic retreat. So there's no question that the U.S. tariffs on China backfired, and it was actually a message to the United States that it is much more dependent on China economically than it assumed. And what often happens is that US officials, because especially in the past few decades, they've been used to the US being the most powerful country, coming out of the unipolar era, they underestimate the abilities of their, so-called adversaries. So Scott Bessent famously said that the US had all of the cards and China had no cards to play. We now know that China had many cards, not only US trade dependency on China overall for consumer products, and Americans want their cheap consumer products from China, but especially things like China's influence over the global supply chain, and especially critical minerals and rare earths, which the US cannot replace in the short term, although it's trying in the medium term. So after the trade war in China failed, Trump actually announced in November 2025 that relations with China were, quote, extremely strong, end quote. But I think we should not read too much into this rhetoric. I think this is a short-term decision to have a strategic retreat, to focus on decoupling economically to the extent they can from China in strategic areas, especially the US is obsessed with making a new supply chain, which I'll talk about. And it doesn't mean that the US is going to be less confrontational in the future. I think it's a short-term strategy. So this leads us to actually a really interesting article that Arnaud wrote. And I agree with a lot of it, but I think there are things we should parse this argument about a new Khrushchev moment. So for instance, Arnaud pointed out that, can't read this, but essentially Arnaud pointed out that Trump could be a Khrushchevian figure, just as after Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev came in the Soviet Union and announced a policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States. However, I think we should keep in mind that when Khrushchev announced the concept of peaceful coexistence, this was not the end of the First Cold War. This was the very beginning of the First Cold War. This was in 1956 when Khrushchev announced the peaceful coexistence policy. And we know that the peak of the First Cold War was really in the 70s. It heated up in the 60s and 70s, and even into the 1980s, it was still very violent, and there were a lot of proxy conflicts. Certainly, the attacks on Nicaragua and the Contras, the war in Afghanistan. So at the same time, I fundamentally do agree with Arnaud's argument that the US has recognized that militarily, the US cannot pursue a full-on frontal confrontation with China, just as the US never had a full-on military confrontation with the Soviet Union. Fortunately, there was never a direct war between the US and the Soviet Union, and that's because both sides had nuclear weapons in large part. And of course, China today has nuclear weapons. And I do not expect there to be a direct war between the US and China. That would be catastrophic for humanity. But let's not forget that, the so-called Cold War is a very misleading term. It was extremely hot for most of the world, especially in the global south. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Cuba, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Angola, Congo, Ethiopia, Mozambique. Now, I don't agree with a lot of Cold War historians who like to say that all of these wars were just proxy wars. I think that's very misleading. So for instance, the Angolan War of National Liberation against Portuguese colonialism was not a proxy war, it was a war against colonialism. But the Soviet Union did support the Angolans, and the US supported the colonialists, like in South Africa, like in Mozambique. So, and certainly in Nicaragua, it was not necessarily a proxy war, there was a popular revolution. But of course, in these conflicts, you have these great powers on different sides. And I expect, unfortunately, to see many more geopolitical conflicts and wars. And China will not like to call them proxy wars. And one difference is China, I don't think, is going to intervene as directly as the Soviet Union. But China is going to support countries that are partners. And I don't think it'll send military forces, but it will send weapons, it will send military support. And I'm worried that we're going to see many more conflicts in the upcoming decades because the US is not going to go down without a fight. Almost no empire ever does go down without a fight. So this is the point I'm stressing here. Obviously, the second Cold War is going to be very different from the first Cold War. I'll point out, for instance, which is a very compelling argument that some people who disagree with me might say, I think it's a strong point. China is much stronger today than the Soviet Union was at its peak. I think there's no dispute about that, especially economically. The Soviet Union was never the biggest economy. It was never the dominant economy in the world. And the Soviet Union was never the largest trading partner of most countries. So I agree with that. But I think we're still in the very early stages of a much larger conflict. And I think what we're going to see is much more fragmentation. And I know after my presentation, we'll talk more about this idea. I think we're not going to see the total end of globalization as we know it. Certainly China is trying to keep this mantle of globalization, but I think what we're going to see is the US is going to try to force a much more fragmented world economically and even technologically, trying to pressure certain countries and regions of the world to cut off China and Chinese technology in certain ways, in certain areas. And it's not going to look like the globalized era of the 90s and the 2000s, where you kind of have one global economy. And in that sense, I think that's going to be one similarity between the first and the second Cold War. You know, we talk about the Iron Curtain, but even, you know, the Iron Curtain is actually not that real. There was still trade that went on between the Soviet Union and Europe. For instance, there was a big fight in the first Cold War. Western Europe bought a lot of oil and natural gas from the Soviet Union. And you had the Ostpolitik policy in Germany. So even at the height of the first Cold War, there was still a lot of trade between the Soviet Union and some of these other countries, not with the US. So I do think that one similarity in this new Cold War is the US is serious about trying to decouple economically from China. I don't think most countries will do that. But let's not forget that even in the first Cold War, most of the world was actually non-aligned. The non-aligned movement represented the majority of humanity. And I think today that'll be very similar. There will be a big non-aligned movement. So let's get into the national security strategy. I think it makes it clear that if you read it carefully, China is still the main target, but not in the short term, because they recognize that they're not powerful enough in the short term. They have all these vulnerabilities, so they need to focus on preparing for a larger conflict in the medium to the long term. So the short term is strategic repositioning, asserting US hegemony in regions that are seen as critically important, primarily Latin America. I do agree with Arnaud that the US will not fully succeed in this, especially economically, because China is the largest trading partner of South America, and the US is actually a competitor with Latin America for trade. Latin America exports many commodities, agricultural goods, corn, soybeans, also, oil, gas. The US is the world's largest oil producer. It exports a lot of soybeans and corn. So the US is actually competing with Argentina and Brazil in the same area for export. So the US can't replace trade with Latin America. So I think that strategy is not going to work. But I think politically, the US will have success in blackmailing and threatening countries in the region to cut off and minimize trades with China politically. For instance, Marco Rubio, in his first trip abroad as Secretary of State, he went to Panama, and he forced Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, and is also trying to force Panama to pressure the Hong Kong company, CK Hutchinson, to sell its holdings in Panamanian ports to a consortium owned by BlackRock. It's kind of, that deal is kind of in limbo, but it's still going through it, allegedly. Now, getting back to the national security strategy, another point we should keep in mind here is when we're reading this rhetoric, the rhetoric was actually softened by the Treasury, which is very funny. And I think this is a reflection of the fact that Scott Bessent, who's a man from Wall Street, he's pragmatic in some ways, although ideologically he's very anti-China. Part of this goes back to his time working with George Soros when they tried to short the Hong Kong dollar and they unsuccessfully they failed. This was during the Asian financial crisis following 1997. And Bessent and Soros failed and they lost a lot of money. So there's kind of this personal grievance that Bessent has. But he is pragmatic, coming from Wall Street, and he recognized that the US actually is dependent on China in many ways, and China has a lot of leverage. So I think we know from Politico, they reported that Bessent pressured the Trump administration to water down the anti-China rhetoric in the national security strategy. Now, if you read it carefully, the national security strategy does describe the Asia-Pacific region to be, in the short term, the second most important region after the Western Hemisphere. And what's very important is it says that it was a mistake to engage with China. So the language is, they say that Trump says there were 3 decades of mistaken American assumptions about China. The US should not have facilitated China's entry into the so-called rules-based international order. They said that China should not have been allowed to join the World Trade Organization. And what's very important about this, they have a very important quote. They say the Indo-Pacific is already and will continue to be among the next century's key economic and geopolitical battlegrounds. To thrive at home, we must successfully compete there. Continuing, they say that the economic battle with China will be among the greatest economic battlegrounds of the coming decades. That language is important because it makes it clear that In the short term, I agree there's a strategic retreat because they recognize that they have too many vulnerabilities, especially supply chains. But they say coming decades, this is the beginning of a much larger conflict. They talk, for instance, about the trade vulnerabilities and how even though US trade with China overall is decreasing, not in gross terms, but as a larger percentage, it's falling. But there's still a lot of third-party trade. China exports to Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and Thailand, and then those exports get rerouted to the US. And they say that the US goal, this is very important, it says that the goal of the United States is to, quote, maintain our status as the world's leading economy, end quote. I mean, they're not the world's leading economy, so I don't think that's going to work, but they're going to try. Now, getting back to this is where I've talked a lot about critical resources and especially critical minerals. A huge part about this national security strategy is the emphasis on the importance of maintaining US dominance over supply chains for critical minerals. And the US has not given up, for instance, trying to improve relations with India to encourage New Delhi to contribute to what they call Indo-Pacific security, which is a way of trying to contain China. Of course, India is part of this Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And this, I think, is a very important quote that was overlooked. Despite all of the watered-down rhetoric, thanks to Besant, they have very Cold War-esque rhetoric. And they say in the national security strategy that, quote, the choice all countries should face is whether they want to live in an American-led world of sovereign countries and free economies, which is very funny because we see that the US does not actually care about sovereignty. China actually puts much more emphasis on sovereignty in the UN Charter. But anyway, so the US is saying that all countries must decide if they want to live in an American-led world or, quote, in a parallel one in which they are influenced by countries on the other side of the world, end quote, by which they, of course, mean China and Russia. For me, this is very dangerous rhetoric. It's Cold War-style rhetoric. I mentioned this issue of the supply chains. This is, I think, one of the biggest advantages that China has, and this is something that the US is going to try to replicate, but I think it's going to be very difficult. Honestly, I'm skeptical about the capacity of the US to do this in the short term, maybe in a few decades, but it's going to be very difficult to create an entirely new supply chain. This is a report from the US House Committee on Competition between the US and China, which is one of the most hawkish anti-China bodies in Washington. And this is their report on creating new supply chains for critical minerals. Now, if you listen to a lot of intellectuals in China, there's a lot of skepticism about this national security strategy. Here I have, this is a report that was published by a scholar at Fudan University, Meng Weizhan, and he emphasized that despite this change in rhetoric, he thinks that the rhetoric should not be taken very seriously, and he argues that the US containment policy, the position toward China, has not changed. And this is a position shared by many scholars in China. Of course, there is a debate happening, but I think it's fair to say that many of them are still a bit skeptical about Trump's rhetoric that being, that the US is no longer seeking containment. In terms of the failure of the trade war, I will say that this has been pretty widely acknowledged. Even, the New York Times, this is Nicholas Kristof. Of course, he's a liberal Democrat, he's very critical of Trump, but, it's widely acknowledged by him and others that Trump lost the trade war. And it really showed in a significant way how the US is much more economically dependent on China than vice versa. And the US has to change its strategy in the short term. Briefly, I just want to point out a few issues. Another big issue facing the US, which also could really hurt its attempt to try to contain China, is the US is facing a lot of structural economic issues domestically. A financial crisis, in my view, is almost certainly on the horizon. And we see that this is the famous Buffett indicator. This is the market capitalization of publicly listed companies as a share of GDP. It's now more than 220%, which is the highest level in recorded US history, much higher than the dot-com bubble. So if and when there's an economic crisis, this will encourage, I think, unfortunately, a kind of further far-right tilt in US politics and more conflict, and especially attempts to scapegoat China, which will likely continue to develop, which could be something similar to the 1930s. There's been a lot of discussion of the AI bubble and all of the circular investments happening, and even top US CEOs are acknowledging that the US is in this AI bubble. So given some of these economic problems, I think the Trump administration assessed that it has to make a short-term retreat and even potentially improve relations with China because of these economic difficulties. For instance, Trump promised to increase U.S. manufacturing. Manufacturing output has been steadily falling. This is a measurement, the PMI, which is a measurement of U.S. production, manufacturing production. It has been falling steadily. Manufacturing jobs in the U.S. have also been declining, especially ironically after Trump announced his tariffs in April. We've seen a steady fall in U.S. manufacturing jobs. Inflation in the U.S. has been persistently high, despite Trump's claims that he'll bring down inflation. And by the way, Goldman Sachs estimated that 55% of the costs of U.S. tariffs imposed by Trump are going ultimately onto the shoulders of consumers. And then the bulk of it, of the other 45%, is being paid by U.S. companies. There are major issues in the U.S. bond market. The Fed has been cutting interest rates, and at the same time, the yields on the 10-year Treasury note, and especially the 20 and 30-year bonds, yields have been going up quite significantly, which normally is not something you would expect, this divergence. And there are also concerns, especially, this is, I think, another issue why the U.S. was forced to take a strategic retreat in the trade war in China, because there were fears that China could sell some of its Treasury holdings. China's been reducing its exposure to U.S. assets for about a decade now. Net holdings by the People's Bank of China of U.S. assets have been falling, and there were fears that the U.S. could sell off U.S. Treasuries, which would further cause instability in the bond market. So the reason I talk about all those issues is that the U.S. is facing a lot of economic problems that will force it into a kind of short-term strategic retreat, but I think we should not confuse that with an acknowledgement, with a concession that the U.S. is going to just continue to decline peacefully and not go down without a fight. So again, I stress that the U.S. secession of this trade war is temporary. And here's a report from Reuters. Trump administration officials say that next year, after the midterm elections, they plan on increasing tariffs on China. So I think, Trump was also concerned about the upcoming midterm elections. So again, I think we should be careful. I very much expect more tariffs to come next year. And then, as I start leaning toward wrapping up my presentation, I think we should keep in mind also, as we move into the future, we need to think not just with Trump in the short term, what direction is U.S. politics likely going to go in? And we see that in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, they're full of China hawks. And if you look especially in the Republican Party, the most likely successors to Trump would be J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio. Both are China hawks, especially Marco Rubio, who kind of made his name as a neoconservative and extreme anti-China hawk. Some believe that Rubio has kind of had a change of heart because as a Secretary of State, he's been a little more pragmatic. But again, I think we should keep in mind that actions are what matter. The base of the Republicans, and especially the MAGA movement, is vociferously anti-China. They kind of even have like a civilizational world conflict view of China, where basically they see China as atheist and communist and Asian and non-white against the white Christian West. Like, we shouldn't underestimate the danger of this kind of worldview. For instance, Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of War, he renamed the Pentagon as the Department of War. He wrote a book in 2020 called American Crusade, in which he said that the U.S. is in a holy war, and that he called himself he said he's in a holy war, and he called himself a crusader. And he said that the main targets in this holy war are communist China. He always says not just China, communist China, also the international left, and Islam, all of Islam, which is crazy. But again, like, these are people who are very powerful in the Republican Party, and I think especially as economic issues get worse in the U.S., we'll see more of these extreme kind of populist forces. And again, we can look at rhetoric of the Trump administration, but we should keep in mind their actions. Trump say they don't want a conflict over Taiwan, but meanwhile, the Trump administration recently approved the largest ever weapons package for Taiwan, which is $11.1 billion. And, Trump himself claims to be a peace president. He now actually has the record. In all of U.S. history, Trump has bombed more countries than every president, which is quite something because, Obama bombed 7 countries. Trump has now bombed 10, and when you consider his first term and his second term. In his second term, he bombed 7 countries. And, again, in his second term, 7 countries. So, we should keep in mind also that I'm not saying that the attack on Venezuela was only about China, but certainly China was part of it. You know, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a close Trump ally, this is a tweet where he says, "To my Chinese friends, in case you were planning a follow-up meeting with Maduro, he has a new address." And he says, China has aligned with every bad actor on the planet. And he says, it's time for the Chinese to pay a price for the so-called chaos they are sowing, which is actually hilarious. It's the US sowing chaos around the world, and China's trying to put out the fire started by the US arsonist. But, I mean, here he's saying very clearly that the US is trying to target some major Chinese partners. Again, I think the US likes to overstate the influence of this. I agree that the US is not going to succeed in cutting China out of Latin America, but the intent is certainly there. And, you know, we've seen this rhetoric from the Trump administration. Bloomberg reported that Besant had what they call a grand encirclement plan for China. Whether or not it succeeds, of course, was another thing. But they said that the US was trying to work with South Korea and Japan and India and the Philippines and even Vietnam, which is not going to work, and some South Asian nations to try to have encirclement of China. That's not succeeding necessarily. But keep in mind that Besant is less hawkish comparatively compared to people like Peter Navarro, who are extreme anti-China hawks. And then the last point I'll make before I conclude here is I think we should kind of look at some structural forces in the US political economy, which is that, you know, there's this irreconcilable economic contradiction. We've talked a lot about geopolitics, but ultimately I think another root of this conflict is the fact that the US does not, a big reason that the US has this very dominant economy is because it has very high-tech industries that have no global competitors. It has basically a monopoly in certain areas in Silicon Valley. And this is responsible for a very high margin, very high profit sectors in the US economy. You know, if you're in mining, you're going to have pretty low margins because there's mining all around the world. If you're designing chips, it's very high margin industries because there are very few people who can compete with NVIDIA. China is trying, but the US has these major monopolies and oligopolies, which they do not want Chinese firms to compete with. Famously, Gina Raimondo, from a Democratic administration, said that the goal was to prevent China from innovating. And I think this is a huge factor driving this very aggressive policy toward China. If you look at Silicon Valley, most people in Silicon Valley are extreme anti-China hawks. For instance, this is Peter Thiel, who is a major backer of Trump. He also funded J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance worked for him. Thiel has this kind of apocalyptic worldview, seeing China as like the Antichrist. They really see China in that way. And of course, for him, it's not just ideological, it's his economic interests. But it's not just Thiel. I mean, for instance, Sam Altman, who's the head of OpenAI, these people in Silicon Valley are openly lobbying the US government to ban Chinese competitors. And they say it's because of national security, but we all know that that's cynical. They seek to block off China technologically because China is the only country on earth that actually challenges their high-tech monopolies. This is an open letter that OpenAI published to the US Office of Science and Technology in Washington. And they say that they must prioritize closing the electron gap between the US and China. They say that China is the biggest threat to the US. They say it's a security threat. But really, it's because China has these open source AI models that are actually challenging OpenAI and other US companies. So I think that a big reason in the long term, not just in the short term, another reason we're going to see very significant conflict is that these economic forces in the US have significant political power, and they are against continued US economic engagement with China. These are the people also pushing for decoupling. You know, Elon Musk, people love to point out that Elon Musk, you know, half of Teslas are manufactured in the Shanghai Tesla Gigafactory. That's true. But actually, what's funny is Elon Musk was the one in the Biden administration who was begging for 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs because he can't compete with Chinese EVs. And similarly, you look at Meta, you look at Google, you look at Amazon. These are people who are the most powerful individuals in the United States with significant political power, who are in the long term, they're invested in preventing improved relations with China because it goes against their own economic interests. And of course, we've seen this symbolically with the Trump administration. Silicon Valley is very powerful, and they're going to be structurally pushing for more and more conflict and economic decoupling from China in the long term. So these are my last 2 or 3 slides. So again, just to conclude, I think we should keep in mind that this is part of a larger structural trend I think we're going to see, which is deeply rooted in not just a few political leaders, it's deeply rooted in the political economy of the world today, of the new global order. China has taken this dominant role as the biggest economy. China is the manufacturing superpower, and it's not just about US politicians. They are reflections of the economic interests of the ruling class of the United States, of these big multinational corporations, of financial interests, of Silicon Valley. And many of these forces, not all of them, there are forces who want this engagement with China, but I think the driving thrust of these forces is for more conflict with China, is to fragmentation of the global economy, and is moving to a world that looks in many ways like the first Cold War, where you don't have this globalized economy. You have a very fragmented economy where the US does what it can to try to divide regions of the world, to pressure them, and to engage in much more violent conflict. And I think what we're seeing now with the attack on Venezuela, threats to attack Iran again, I unfortunately think this is the beginning of a much larger and a very dangerous conflict, because we know, as I conclude, this is my last word, that, there's been a lot of discussion about this idea of the Thucydides trap. Graham Ellison is this political scientist at Harvard, and he pointed out that throughout history, the vast majority of empires do not peacefully accept their decline. And I think especially in a country like the US, which has been an especially violent empire, it is not going to go down without a fight. And when you look at the many wars that it has engaged in, when you look at the many aggressive policies it's engaged in, I am very concerned. I wish this were not true, but I think we're entering a period of extreme geopolitical conflict, and I think this is the beginning of something much larger, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for that. That is a very compelling argument, and it sounds like the main point here is that you could legitimately point to some public-facing statements that would lead one to believe that China is no longer the main target, or that there isn't this Cold War. But in actuality, even if it looks like there's a temporary retraction, they still remain the main target. They still fully believe they're in a Cold War, and they're going to do everything to try to win that Cold War.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, do you think, though, that if they have a certain number of failed attempts at containing China, even if it's in their own hemisphere, even if, for example, Venezuela is a win, I guess we remain to see whether it ends up becoming a win or not, but let's say they're able to destabilize countries one by one like this, but the net overall result is that it drives more countries towards China, like Canada and like we're seeing with all of these other countries. Is there ever a scenario in your mind where eventually they abandon this containment policy? They abandon trying to go after China, and they say, you know what, this just isn't working. Is that even possible?
I think the response in Washington will unfortunately be the opposite, because the US does not have many carrots to offer. What are the carrots the US has to offer? Market access. So the stick is tariffs are essentially a weaponization of US market access. The way the global economic order has worked for decades, really since the kind of creation of Bretton Woods with the dollar as the global reserve currency, but especially since 71 when the dollar was taken off of gold and the US became a big, it had a very large current account deficit, a trade deficit with the rest of the world. It became a big deficit country. The US sucked in, like a global vacuum, it sucked in the surplus of countries around the world. So the US they used this, China sent its exports to the US, Japan, Germany, and now what Trump is saying is we're going to weaponize that. You no longer will have access to the US market through the form of tariffs. Okay, well, that's one carrot, US market access. The other real carrot that they have is like not imposing sanctions, which is like the flip side of the stick. But other than that, China offers many more carrots. Infrastructure, lower cost, better quality goods. China does not intervene in foreign countries' affairs. So increasingly, the US is going to see that because they have no carrots, they will have to resort more and more to sticks. So I think what we're seeing with Trump now is the beginning of really a return to what the US wants to see as a return of the law of the jungle. This is a very dangerous moment in history. China is doing what it can to try to defend international law. The actual, what the West calls the rules-based international order, which means nothing. It means they make the rules. The actual rules are established by international law in the UN Charter. China is trying to defend that, but unless China is going to militarily fight the US, which it's not going to do because China does not want to China does not want to go down the same trap, does not want to fall in the trap that the Soviet Union fell in, which is that the Soviet Union engaged in many of these conflicts, and like in Afghanistan, which the US started this famous bear trap that Brzezinski laid, and that was a significant reason leading to the decline of the Soviet Union, with all this massive military spending and Star Wars and all of that. China doesn't want to fall in that trap, but at the same time, the US is going to engage in much more military aggression. So with countries like Canada, okay, the US response, unfortunately, I think will be fine. Mark Carney can go and make a trade deal, so the US will be even more aggressive against Canada. Latin American countries will say, fine, we'll keep trading with China, so the US will engage in more military action. I really think what the US got the wrong lessons from the Venezuela attack, from the attack on Iran. They think that for them it's very low cost. Maybe internationally the costs are higher than they think, but that's not the way that policymakers in Washington are seeing it.
Right. They're relying on coercion. And Arnaud, one of the points you made was that one of the ways that the U.S. Won the Cold War was through attraction rather than coercion. If they all of a sudden readopted that strategy, would it even work? Or, as to Ben's point, they just don't have any carrots left?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ben on that, and it's also what I said in my talk, that at the end of the day, it's a question of value proposition. And when your model relies on competing with China on value and cost, you don't have a model, you have a problem, right? So that's going to be difficult. And I agree with Ben that what they're left with is coercion, but again, coercion is a very unappealing value proposition. So it can work here and there, but structurally, you cannot coerce the whole world. It means the more and more coercive you're going to be, the more and more the world is going to start to align against you. And we are definitely seeing that trend. I mean, as we speak, you have European nations, which is crazy when you think about it, sending troops to Greenland to defend themselves against the US. It's extraordinary. So I think we agree on much together with Ben. And we agree that, I agree with you that there is temporary, that the US thinks that their current retreat is temporary and that eventually they want, to go back at containing China. But there is a very, very big assumption there, which is that they regain their strength in order to be able to do so. And that's definitely not the trend that we're seeing. On the contrary, everything they're doing is making them lose power in a significant number of ways. And yes, they're going to become more and more desperate, like some sort of angry predators, feeling that the end is near and sort of lashing out and so on. But we should not confuse that for strength, because that's actually weakness, I think.
Here, I strongly agree with you. It's a sign of weakness. It's a reflection of that weakness. But the point I really want to emphasize, and I didn't say this openly in the presentation because it's very dark, but I'll be very honest. When you look at imperial decline, and this is what Graham Ellison doesn't really focus on a lot. He talks about the Thucydides trap, but most empires, when they're in their stage of decline, is when they're the most violent. We saw this with the Ottoman Empire, and we certainly saw this with Germany. And I'm going to be accused here of violating Godwin's law. Everything eventually becomes a comparison to Nazi Germany. But I really am afraid about the far right turn in Western politics in general, in Europe, but especially in the US. And on your point, I strongly agree with you that because the US has so few carrots, it's going to have to resort to force, because China is offering objectively a better deal for most countries. Better products, better technology, non-intervention, infrastructure. It's just objectively better. But I think the US will not accept that and will resort to war, like Germany did, like the Ottoman Empire did, and like other empires have done.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? And also that China is still kind of the long-term target for the US, and that from the US's perspective, they are in a full-on Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I don't even have to agree or not. It's a fact with Venezuela. I mean, we saw it, but if you look at Venezuela in particular, for instance, It's quite funny when you think about it, because Venezuela's industry is first and foremost oil, right? And who's going to buy their oil at the end
China.
of the day? It's not going to be the US, because
Trump even said that, yeah.
Exactly. So even then, when you resort to war, there is no escaping China, right? It's Venezuela, because of structural reason, is going to have to keep its relations with China. So I think, at some stage the US is bound to recognize that. And it's not only Venezuela. We saw that with the war in Iraq as well. Like they did the war in Iraq presumably to get benefits from that, but who steps in to rebuild Iraq, for instance, who gets most of the infrastructure contract and so on?
China.
It's China, simply because the US cannot do infrastructure anymore. So there is just no choice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, do you think that alongside this effort of, because it sounds like containment is still on the table, there is also some sort of an effort for the US to still figure out how to coexist with China in this world? Is that potentially where there might be a difference of opinion? Like, do you think that coexistence is also a major priority of the US, since they've inevitably conceded that containment is ultimately impossible?
I mean, I think there is no choice. So it's not, at some point they will have to find a way to coexist with China. Whether, and I think some strands in the US start to go there. And even I would say Trump himself personally is asking himself the question. I mean, he keeps saying, I have a very good relationship with China. I mean, he keeps emphasizing that. He's probably not 100% truthful, of course, but you can see he's kind of toying with that idea. What form exactly this coexistence is going to take is very hard to say, because there is no escaping the fact that they are competitors, and accepting China's existence will mean that it's not 100% positive for the US. It will be hard. There is no denying it. But when you have no choice, you have no choice.
Right. Yeah. And Ben, so do you think that there's any productive attempts at coexistence, and even if some of China's carrots potentially work on the US, like, do you think that there's anybody there that will, alongside this effort to contain China, that they still will try to build some sort of coexistence and somehow benefit from the fact that China is a major player on the global stage now?
Well, you have to ask what drives US policymaking. And there have been many studies. There's this famous Princeton study that shows that average people in the US have no tangible influence on policymaking. It's large economic interests. So think about the different economic interests competing in the US. You have Silicon Valley, big tech companies, probably the most powerful, along with Wall Street. And then you have some manufacturing domestically, Ford, GM. I think these companies have been declining for many decades, and they will continue to decline. This idea of like this great rebirth of manufacturing in the US is not going to succeed. You have a big oil, fossil fuel industry. You have the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma. Most of these industries do not want to compete with China. They're the ones begging for more tariffs, for protectionism. There are a few sectors that do want access to the China market. It's not that many anymore. And especially if you look at the ones in the driving seat, Silicon Valley. There are some people in Wall Street who have invested a lot in China. Interestingly, Steven Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, was a big funder of Trump, and he has a lot of investments in China. He has some programs here. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, Elon Musk has the Gigafactory. But look at a lot of these people in Silicon Valley. They're vehemently anti-China, and I think that's going to continue to increase over the long term, because, as Arnaud correctly pointed out, they can't compete with China. Like, it's a matter of their own economic interests. So I think what's interesting about this kind of second Cold War is, like I said, in the first Cold War, it was pretty obvious that the Soviet Union was much weaker than the US. And I think it's clear in this new Cold War that China has a lot of advantages. I think we should be careful not to underestimate the US military power. Arnaud pointed out that China has this very vast military, and in terms of numbers, China is larger than the US. But a good thing is that China hasn't fought a war since 1979. Of course, that's a good thing for the world. China does not intervene. But the US might not have as many forces, but the US is skilled in destabilizing countries, invading countries, bombing countries. You can say that the US, maybe didn't meet many of its goals, whatever they were, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The famous joke is the US spent 20 years, they overthrew the Taliban and they reinstalled the Taliban. True, but the US is really good at destabilizing and destroying foreign countries. So when I say we're entering a period of a lot of stability, I think we're going to see much more of that. So I think even though China has advantages economically, China has advantages in soft power and diplomatically, the US also has some advantages.
Yeah, just to add on the economic points, I completely agree that American companies are scared, and rightly so, of competing with China, and that the US is moving towards some kind of protectionism. But actually, protectionism makes you weaker economically, because it makes it, it simply reduces the amount of competition, and therefore companies are not incentivized to do good enough products, and bit by bit you lose actually more of your competitiveness on the global stage. So even economically, and we're seeing that, by the way, even with Musk and Tesla. Like if you look at Tesla's position on the European market right now, where it is directly competing with Chinese cars, it's scary numbers. Huh? You're looking at minus 70% market share year on year and so on. So even economically, I think the US, if they don't want to keep losing, sooner or later they will have to arrive at the conclusion that they need to learn from China in order to compete with them, which is, by the way, exactly the conclusion that at some point the Soviet Union took, which is like they saw that they were not competitive against the Western model, and so they opened up and decided to learn from the West. The same thing that China did. Why are Chinese car industries or many of its industries so competitive? It's not because of protectionism. It's on the contrary because they learned from the West and they got a lot of Western. So that's the way to do this. So I think the U.S. I think there is a Churchill quote around the U.S. eventually doing the right thing after trying all the wrong things. Eventually they will arrive there, or they will keep losing. Which either way, it's from a Chinese standpoint, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah. But not sustainable on their side. You have to wonder though, like these companies like GM and Ford, why they don't take the Tesla route. I mean, Tesla sells a lot of vehicles in China. Toyota sells a lot of vehicles in China. Have they just conceded that they just, in their current state, they can't compete with Chinese vehicles in terms of tech, in terms of price and all of this? Like you would think that would be the priority for a company like GM to say, we need to find a way to survive.
Well, you might know this better than I do. I think they had pretty significant market access in China several decades ago, and it's fallen drastically because, again, there are so many options, and Chinese cars are objectively better. I mean, we've all been in them. Like, China has like more than 100 EV makers, and they're extremely high quality and very low cost. And by the way, all of those companies have razor-thin profit margins, very low profit margins. I agree with you. When it comes to this protectionist element, there's certainly an element of like rent seekers in the US. These big companies, they don't want to compete with China, one, because they can't, and also because it really hurts their profit margins. Yeah. But when you have these strong protectionist measures, it's much easier to seek rents and have much higher profits. So I think we're going to see a significant turn to that in many industries. We talked about cars, but for the U.S. Economy, manufacturing is not really that important anymore. But you have big pharma doesn't want to compete with Chinese drug makers, which is a very protected industry in the U.S. You have certainly Silicon Valley, which is really the driving force, and especially as AI becomes more adopted, we're going to see more and more of that. Which is why I think, as you pointed out, Arnaud, so much of this kind of new Cold War, this conflict, has been fought in the terrain of high tech, of AI, semiconductors, quantum computing, all of the sectors the U.S. has targeted with China, with tariffs and export restrictions on China, those are going to become so important for the economy in the upcoming decades. So it's, I don't expect the US manufacturing sector to be revived. And then, of course, there's one other sector I didn't mention, which is the military-industrial complex. And this is, the point that people make about, I mentioned this supply chain diversification strategy. A big reason that the US is trying to do this is because so much of the US military-industrial complex depends on Chinese-dominated supplies, including critical minerals and rare earths, to make weapons and military equipment that the US wants to prepare for future conflict with China. That obviously is not going to work.
And their current method, the current things that they're doing around the world are, as we can see, driving countries towards China. You have, particularly in the global south, after what happened with Venezuela, even with Canada, with our PM Carney coming over here. But Europe now, Europe is kind of at a crossroads. Now, we had a discussion online, not too long ago about how Europe is kind of stuck in this middle ground. They're not really unified with one single strong leader, and they're not individual independent countries. They're kind of stuck in this middle ground that is not better than either of those possible options. Since that conversation, have things changed? And are we going to see Europe finally come closer to China?
That's actually why I wrote the article on the Khrushchev moment that Ben referenced in his talk, because the Khrushchev moment was Khrushchev saying that he was pursuing peaceful coexistence with the US in the middle of the Cold War, because he wanted to concentrate on the Soviet sphere. A bit what you're saying, the US strategy is now. They recognized that they were non-competitive, so they wanted to focus on themselves, on stop the ideological competition for a while in order to regain strength and eventually win. But what that did was that led to the Sino-Soviet split, with China, saying that I think the official Chinese expression by Mao was that Khrushchev was a revisionist traitor. And it's interesting because we're seeing a bit of that with Europe and the US. So they had the same ideology, right? Which was, liberal hegemony. We want to convert the whole world to liberal democracy and so on. And suddenly you have Trump from a European perspective, who is like a revisionist traitor, right? So that's why I made the comparison. It's quite interesting. And that is the irony when it comes to Europe. The only ones right now still left in the world who are advocating for liberal, US-led liberal hegemony is not even the US, it's Europe. And,
the Democrats are, but they're not in power.
Yeah. And on my latest article that I wrote was I advocated for a renewal of Gaullism from De Gaulle in Europe, because obviously that ideology is dying. It's just not adapted to a multipolar world. And so Europe is eventually going to arrive at an ideological dead end. They will have to choose a new ideology, which is a scary proposition for Europe, because generally when we choose new ideologies, it can lead to some to some pretty bad moments for the world, which is why I advocate Gaullism, because Gaullism is a very constructive, positive ideology where you build, there is no hatred like in fascism or Nazism and so on, which we have a big tendency. There is zero hatred, but there is love for yourself as a people, and there is a notion of grandeur, the greatness. So you need to work on your self-greatness, which is actually not that dissimilar to the ideology in China, and which is why, by the way, De Gaulle is so admired in China. There is only one Western leader who got a national day of mourning in the entire of China's history, and that's De Gaulle.
China calls it national rejuvenation.
Yeah. It's quite similar to the Gaullist concept of grandeur. So I think it would be good if they went that road rather than the fascist road, obviously.
And you were looking at some public opinion polls from Canada also, because obviously this visit from Canada's Prime Minister was a major shifting point also. And so you're seeing Canada being driven closer to China also. And you were talking about specific polling also, right?
Yeah, well, part of this is partisan, of course. You know, in Canada, when Biden was president, when Trump was president the first time, public opinion of the US and Canada fell drastically. The US became very unpopular. When Biden came in, suddenly public approval increased. But what's interesting is throughout Biden's 4 years, Canadian public opinion of the US, views of the US, fell drastically. And now under Trump, it's at the lowest level since records have been kept. About 2/3 of Canadians have a negative view of the US. About 1/3 have a positive view. It's largely partisan again. But what's interesting is, in this case of Europe, I agree with Arnaud. I think like reviving this kind of de Gaulle spirit of strategic autonomy, this term that has been bandied about, used by European leaders for over a decade now, and they haven't really done anything. Angela Merkel talked about it. Macron has been saying this for a decade and hasn't done anything. What's interesting is, we were talking about this before our conversation today, that these US threats against Greenland could maybe be this final moment where Europe does take this idea seriously, which I think would be good for Europe and it would be good for the world. I mean, as bad as it is for Greenland, of course, I'm 100% against the US attempt to colonize Greenland. It's horrible. But if it forces Europe to finally wake up, then Europe will recognize that it's being actually, that its obsession with Atlanticism and this idea from many European leaders that the US leads this transatlantic order, that Europe benefits from that order. It's not true. Europe is not benefiting from, at least the people of Europe. Now, certain European elites are benefiting from this order. I like to point out that there's interesting data. If you look at global investment in the US stock market by region, Europe actually has twice as much investment in the US stock market compared to all of Asia. Asia has the majority of the world population. So when you account for Europe's population, that's like 10 times more investment per capita in the US stock market. So many of these European elites, they were educated in the US, they're invested in US assets, like they're deeply invested in this. But if finally this is what it takes to break that, then that could be good for Europe. But at the same time, we had a conversation about this. I still don't believe that they will. Like, the US is going to attack a NATO member. You know, Greenland is technically an autonomous territory of Denmark, and I still don't think the Europeans will actually follow up. So in the same with Canada. You know, Canadians can have a negative view of the US, but again, we're talking about larger processes. You know where 80% of Canadian exports go is to the US. Yeah, some of those exports can be rerouted to China, although Canada doesn't have the infrastructure needed, the pipelines needed to reroute a lot of that to China. It's possible, but this will take probably 10 or 20 years to create that infrastructure, to reroute that trade. And, you know, what will the US do in the meantime? And like I said, I'm really concerned. Like, this rhetoric we see in the US of Canada is going to be the 51st state, we're going to annex Canada. It's not a joke. And especially as the US goes further to the right, I talked about the possibility of another financial crisis. I'm really concerned about that in the US, this kind of 1930s moment. And again, I don't want to be accused of Godwin's law, but I think people should not underestimate the kind of fascistic current in US politics today. And it's not going to end with Donald Trump.
Right. And from the perspective of a European, do you think that that's the case, that Europe may just take this lying down if America just goes after Greenland? Do you think that there won't really be any sort of a meaningful reaction?
I don't think so, to be honest, because, I mean, first of all, you do have reactions. And the statements are actually uncharacteristically strong from leaders who have been traditionally very Atlantist, like Macron or even Starmer. Starmer characterized the US, the latest Trump statement on Greenland as completely wrong, which is quite a strong, statement from someone like Starmer, who is extremely pro-Atlanticist. So, I mean, if the question is whether the US will go and take Greenland
and what will happen as a result? What will Europe do? Because of course they have, like Ben was alluding to, public-facing comments. Yeah. What they actually do or what they plan to do sometimes can be different. Can they even do anything?
if there is a war over it with the US, I think Europe will lose in the present. I don't think there is any discussion around that, if only for the fact that most of European armament comes from the US, and the way these work is they have off switch. You know, when the US sells you F-35 or something, they have an off switch, and obviously they will turn on the off switch if we ever fight against them. Or there is the fact that our entire intelligence infrastructure is based on Palantir, even in France. And Palantir is, of course, an American company. And I'm sure they have an off switch as well. So, if we fight against them, we're in a very bad place, obviously. But it doesn't mean that we will accept it. It could lead to a situation like, in France, we have this Alsace-Lorraine issue where at some point Germany took Alsace and Lorraine from us, and at the time where we were weak, and we lost it during 70 years or so, but it became an incredibly powerful rallying issue for us, and that's why we fought World War I, right? And if ever the US does that to Greenland, that could become the European equivalent to that.
Right. And drive them to, sorry, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, this raises, I think, a very important point. Arnaud mentioned that European militaries are dependent on US infrastructure, so US, not only the actual planes and the weapons, but also the software. And I think this is another point that we really should briefly mention, because Arnaud and I both strongly agree that China is offering objectively a better deal for pretty much everyone, and that China has a lot of good advantages. But we also should not, I think we should be careful not to downplay and underestimate the significant power that the US has certain sectors, especially control over the financial system, which we are, one of my big issues that I focus on a lot is de-dollarization. And we're seeing this move toward a more multipolar financial system. But this is a process that's going to take decades. And the US can still cause a lot of damage, especially to countries in Europe that are deeply integrated in this infrastructure. Most of it's located in Europe. We talk about the US-controlled financial system. Where is SWIFT located? It's in Brussels. So where is the Bank of International Settlements? It's in Europe. It's in Switzerland, I believe, right? Basel, Switzerland, yeah. So Europe is the heart of that US-dominated financial system. It would be impossible for Europe to create an alternative to that in the short term. And even over decades, it would be very difficult. And then technologically, the situation is even worse. Technologically, Europe is totally dependent on the US in every way. In fact, most of the world is. China is the only real exception. This is why what China did was so important with its kind of, people call the firewall, but really I think of it as kind of its own protectionist policies, whereas China recognized that it did not want to be completely dependent on the US for cloud computing. You look at global cloud computing, global market share is entirely dominated by the US, especially AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, these massive giants. In the case of Europe, all of that infrastructure, that digital infrastructure, all of these websites, it's hosted by largely US big cloud platforms. Then you look at telecommunications. Europe had a lot of Huawei equipment, and at US orders, they agreed to kick it all out of their own domestic infrastructure. Look at Google, its penetration of all of Europe. You look at Microsoft. We were talking about how, the US put these illegal sanctions on the International Criminal Court. So the prosecutor of the ICC at The Hague lost access to his email account because it was Microsoft. So Europe is really dependent on the US, not just for military reasons, but in terms of its entire software, its entire technological infrastructure, and that's not something that can be replaced. Even if they wanted to, where is it going to come from? China could offer some alternatives, but Europe needs to develop its own alternatives, and that's going to take many decades.
That's a perfect example to explain why China took this approach, because had they not taken that approach and they were just as reliant, they wouldn't have won this trade war. They would have been, when the US was ready to crush them, they would have had all the tools ready and in place. And it sounds like, though, if Europe wants to escape this, like you said, America can put a lot of pressure and deliver a lot of pain to them in the short term, and they will have to go through that short-term pain for long-term gain, which is incredibly difficult.
They can't go through it. It would literally lead to a collapse of European society if the U.S.
So they're stuck.
They said Microsoft and Google are not allowed to operate in Europe. The entire European economy, healthcare, the political system, everything is based on this digital infrastructure. And this is why, a quick point, India passed this policy to ban Chinese apps. So what happened? They just use US apps. I mean, they have a few apps in like delivery, but like when it comes to the very important technological infrastructure we need for a modern society, it's all US infrastructure.
There is some European infrastructure, I will say, but I mean, in general, we are extremely dependent on that's true.
The world is, except for China.
Yeah, but I mean, there are some local initiatives in France, for instance. You often assume that the big payment providers, that in Europe you only have Visa and MasterCard, but actually there is a third one, which is Carte Bleue, which is a pure French one, which only relies on French infrastructure. So we have some things, but it would indeed take many, many years to weed ourselves off from the US. But what the current situation shows is that it's badly needed.
No, what we strongly agree on is Europe should do that. They should have started it 20 years ago, but I hope this could be a wake-up call. If the US attacks Greenland, which I think is very likely, they will have to do it. But my point is that Europe cannot just cold turkey cut off the US. And Canada can't either. 80% of Canada's exports go to the US. So I'm saying we shouldn't underestimate US power. I'm saying this is going to be a decades-long process.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, like you said, cold turkey, but they try to put these systems in place to slowly move closer to China. I'm sure there will still be retaliation for that. I'm sure that the US will look at that and say, I see what's going on, and they're going to have to just push through it in order to get to that stage. The question is whether they can or can't. We're going to move to audience questions soon, but I wonder if you guys had any questions for each other on reconciling any differences of opinion or the way that you describe things. It sounds like you mostly agree, but you have different ways of describing things. But if you had questions for each other before we go to the audience, I'll give you that opportunity.
I mean, I think we mostly agree. If there was one difference, I think, but I don't even think that's a difference, that you said they're in strategic retreat in the short term, but in the medium to long term, they will eventually, go back at containing China. But I think, do you think I don't think they will succeed at that, and I think you agree as well, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. This is what I mentioned. I think the U.S. strategy, it's kind of clear. It's not really hidden. Yeah. They recognize that there are these strategic choke points, these vulnerabilities that China really has, that the U.S. has, that China has over it, right? Which is mainly critical minerals and the global supply chain, rare earths, and then also trade dependency in certain areas. And they want to try to replace that. Whether or not they can, I think, is an open question. I am often of the view that the U.S. can't. But there are people, the very smart experts on these issues who say that the U.S. has made a lot of progress in like domestic mining and rare earth processing. The U.S. government's investing a lot in this. In fact, what's funny is Trump is borrowing some ideas from China with this industrial policy of like state investment in certain strategic companies, which I never thought I would see the U.S. government do, like certain mining companies. So I think there certainly is a very concerted, all hands on deck attempt in Washington. This was under Biden, certainly, with the CHIPS Act and the funnily named Inflation Reduction Act, which is mostly about, actually pushing for industrial policy. But I'm still pretty skeptical about whether or not that will work. But what I do think is going to happen, we've already seen this trend, is that we'll see a gradual decoupling. I think in the US, they're very serious about this. Because, back in the first Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US did very little trade. Although, like I mentioned, the Soviet Union and Western Europe did trade. The Soviet Union and India did a lot of trade. India's largest trading partner was the USSR. So I think people like to point out at India today. Well, India has always played that non-aligned position. India was a co-founder of the non-aligned movement and saw itself as the leader of the non-aligned movement. So I think we're going to see something similar in the world in the upcoming decades. China is the largest trading partner of most countries. The US cannot replace that. It's just not possible. So most countries will try to play some kind of non-aligned role. But I think the US response will be much more aggressive, much more overtly interventionist. The 90s and the 2000s, there were a lot of interventions, but this whole idea of the rules-based order, that's a product of US unipolar hegemony. They didn't say that back in the 60s and 70s. They were like, make the economy scream. Famously, in Chile, when the people voted for the socialist Allende, we have declassified documents. Kissinger said, the people of Chile will not be allowed to make this decision. That's been the dominant US foreign policy for decades. The 90s and the 2000s were kind of when they talked about this whole idea of like liberal human rights nonsense. That was never the dominant thrust of US foreign policy. So what I do think will happen is that we've seen that in 2020, about 19% of China's exports went to the US. Now it's about 14%. And I think that will continue to fall. And we'll see much less direct trade, although I think we'll still see indirect trade through third parties, Vietnam. But even then, like, the US basically forced Mexico to put 50% tariffs on China because they knew that so much Chinese investment was going into Mexico and then being exported to the US because they have a free trade agreement. I think we'll see much more of that. And in general, much more politicization of trade. Like, we're never going back to this 90s and early 2000s era of globalization.
Right, exactly. Well, I think this is a good time to introduce some audience questions. So can we see, does anybody in the audience have some questions for our guests?
I do have a few questions, but I first want to start with maybe this general one, and if we have time, maybe we can come back to me or whatever. I think you guys kind of briefly talked about it, but what would be the general consequences for Latin America? Can they de-risk from the United States, for example, whether that's strategically, economically, or through, like you were talking about, communications, like telecommunications? Is this something that they are capable of doing in the medium to long term, while the U.S. maybe is reeling right now from the position it's in with China?
Yeah, that's your specialty, is Latin America. So let's,
Yeah, this is very difficult for Latin America. It's a region I love. I have lived in for many years. I feel personally invested in, but just being realistic, it's going to be very difficult. And unfortunately, I think the upcoming decades are going to be very painful because the U.S., is asserting this colonial Monroe Doctrine. And it's interesting. I mean, I agree with Arnaud in some ways. For instance, economically, the U.S. cannot replace China in certain key areas. For instance, because of the deindustrialization we saw, largely due to a lot of the neoliberal policies in the 80s and 90s, the famous década perdida, the lost decade, we saw that, back in the 1960s, actually, South America was the region of the world with the highest manufacturing share of GDP. Argentina, Brazil, Chile less, but especially Argentina and Brazil and Mexico were major industrial powers. Brazil made planes and jet engines. And what we've seen in that neoliberal era is that they really heavily deindustrialized, and the Latin American economies became very dependent on exporting commodities, agricultural goods, raw ores, these kinds of things. And the U.S. simply cannot replace China for that. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. It has 1.4 billion people. It's a lot of mouths to feed. China imports so much soy from Brazil and from Argentina, so much iron ore from Brazil, oil, natural gas, everything. Corn also, and you know what top US exports are? Soybeans, corn, gas, LNG, oil. So in that sense, the US literally cannot replace China. So the US is telling Latin America, stop trading with China. This, I think, explains Argentina. Argentina's economy has been largely deindustrialized, especially now under Milei's libertarian policies, ending industrial policy, ending state support for local manufacturing. So Argentina has to sell those soybeans and that corn to someone, and they sell it to China. Ironically, when the US under Trump put these very high tariffs on China, what happened is that China stopped importing soybeans from US farmers who voted for Trump, and they bought more soybeans from Argentina and Brazil. So ironically, that actually increased trade with China. But that's one thing. And from the US perspective, it's not really strategic. They don't really care if Latin America sells commodities to China. But when it comes to Chinese investment in Latin America, we've seen a lot recently. I think the US is going to blackmail a lot of countries in Latin America and tell them you cannot accept Chinese investment. So for instance, we've seen a lot of discussion about like BYD opening factories in Mexico, and recently those deals fell through. BYD is opening factories in Brazil. So I think we will see some, but I think we're going to see a lot of de-risking, and a lot of Chinese companies that want to invest in Latin America are not going to do it because they're afraid of US retaliation. And Chinese companies that already are going to be targeted by the US. So I think we will still see a lot of trade because it's just impossible for the US to replace that. But in Chinese investment, and especially infrastructure, we're going to see lots of US threats. We already have seen this with the Panama Canal. I mentioned that Marco Rubio went to Panama. He forced Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road. He's forcing Panama to force this Hong Kong company to sell these ports. Trump claims that China controls the Panama Canal. It's not true. But we're also going to see other art infrastructure in the region targeted. I think the next major target is the port of Chongqing in Peru. We've already seen that Trump's top Latin America advisor, Mauricio Carone, is calling for the U.S. to put high tariffs on all goods that go through the port of Chongqing. So I think what we're going to see is this very strange moment where Latin America's trade with China increases, but its political engagement with China is cut off. And unfortunately, as you know, there are a lot of political leaders in Latin America who are fine with that. It's so funny because in countries like Argentina and Brazil that have these very commodity-oriented economies, they have these big landlords who are very right-wing and they all hate China, but they're so dependent on exporting to China, but they all love the US. So we're going to be in this strange situation where leaders like Milei, they're politically going to ally themselves much more closely with the US. And Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, and if they have like a right-wing, I mean, not Bolsonaro, but another Bolsonaro ally in Brazil, it's like we saw in Brazil. They allied more closely with China politically, but economically they continue trading.
That's, there's no, lucky for them, there's no requirement from Beijing to be politically aligned with China in order to trade, which is the complete opposite of the situation.
There's one condition, which is recognition of the one China policy. And, Milei, of course, he said that because if he did not say that, that would undermine the very diplomatic foundation of relations with China. I'll make one quick point. We're going to see one region of the world, unfortunately, where we've seen a trend over the past, 50 years. When China joined the UN in 1971, almost every country on earth recognizes the one China policy. There are 12 countries on earth that do not. The majority of them are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think the US is going to start pressuring these small countries like Honduras. Is going to be the next country that cuts off formal diplomatic relations with China. Now, obviously, from China's perspective, Honduras is not like a major strategic partner. It's a tiny country in Central America. But again, it's part of this larger political game. And symbolically, even though Honduras is not a big country, it will be part of this US strategy to try to undermine China.
Arnaud, very briefly, is there an escape route for Latin America? And do you agree with Ben's assessment that there's going to be a lot of pain coming up in the next decade or so for Latin America and potentially other parts of the global south?
Yes, I agree. I mean, generally when the US says that you're their main target, it's typically not good news, unfortunately. Structurally, I think we're coming back to this question of competing on values. So you can, and even for the US themselves, by the way, you can be as politically opposed to China as you want. But at the end of the day, if you have the choice between, like, say, a $5 toaster and a $20, Texas-made toaster, you go for the $5 toaster. That's just structural. So, there is this famous meme online of a factory in China doing those anti-China hats. Yeah, it's that's the perfect metaphor, right?
It is.
Yeah,
exactly.
Trump's MAGA hats are still made in China.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It's the audience again.
Okay, both of you made excellent points, and I agree with both of you on every single thing you said, even the things you disagreed with each other about. To me, the thing that stuck in my mind is the idea of a second Cold War and how, regardless of people want to see it or want to recognize it or want to fight it, it is here, it is happening. People just have to deal with that. But China has an extreme aversion to using sticks. The notion of carrots and sticks came up a lot in both of your talks. and they're not taking the USSR route. They won't engage with America directly. They won't engage via proxies. They won't fund, friendly governments, friendly militaries, uprisings. They won't do any of that. So is it possible for China to win the Second Cold War entirely with carrots and zero sticks? And to ask almost a comical question about a very serious topic, how much do you think it would take for China to buy America? Not buy the entire country of America, but you always see these posts on social media where it says, so-and-so, Marco Rubio, $300,000 from Israel-aligned interests, $200,000 from big oil, $100,000. That is pennies to China. I legitimately think that every single sitting member of the U.S. Congress, you could $2 for every $1 that they get from Israel, oil, Wall Street, and big tech. China could do that without blinking an eye. Can they win the Second Cold War only with carrots? But not, this is going to sound ridiculous, offensive carrots, not defensive carrots like building Belt and Road, things with their friends, but offensive carrots, just saying, we'll just pay to win.
So yeah, those are two interesting questions. The first with the sticks, because that's obviously a good question. If the U.S. is going around destabilizing all of China's partners one by one, taking out Venezuela, which puts all of Chinese investments in the country in a kind of a questionable area now, do they eventually pull out a stick? Or is that just not in the options? And then if, I don't think China would ever do that, but if China were to create a pro-China lobby, do you think it's possible to buy out American politicians the same way other lobby groups do? I'll start with you, Arnaud.
Yeah, so I think, my read of of Chinese strategy is that they really want to position themselves as a different model from the US. And so if you start to go into this Cold War, bloc versus bloc, then you're basically just like the other guy, but for the other side, right? And therefore, you do not represent a new model. And that's what China, if you read all their, initiative, like the Global Governance Initiative and so on, they're really trying to promote a new model, a better world. And if you start to follow the rules of the old world, the Cold War rules and so on, obviously you undermine your own rhetoric on the new model that you want to create. And there is also some learnings from that, from China's own history, like for instance, during the Three Kingdom period, at the end there were only two kingdoms competing, Qin versus, I can't remember what was the other one. And anyway, they arrived at an agreement to be co-emperor of China because they were both very, very strong. But Qin was always the very aggressive one. And a lot of people started to say, okay, if you guys are co-emperor, then I would rather rally with Qin because, if you guys are the same, I'd rather, align with the strong one. And of course, Qin ended up, winning and becoming the only emperor. So I think China doesn't want to do that it doesn't want to become co-emperor of the world with the US because then you might face a similar dynamic. On to your last point on buying, monetary wise, of course they could. It would be a small expense. But first of all, I think the US has laws against that. Like for Israel is sort of the odd exception, but I don't think they will take kindly to the US. Yeah, I don't think they will take kindly to China doing that. And also the cardinal principle of China's foreign policy is non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. And again, it relates to the model that you want to represent. Like, they don't want to do double standards, they don't want to be hypocrites and so on. So if you start to behave like buying out all the US politicians, then you undermine your own world, right?
Yeah. I'd be very interested to hear from you, Ben. Let's say the laws about lobbying the government became a little bit more open and wasn't exclusive for one particular country. Do you think that would even be possible? Because maybe there's a little bit more than money at play here, because some of the stuff you describe, it ironically seems like religious extremism is sometimes involved, which is ironic because this is what they're trying to paint Islam as, where some people are even calling themselves crusaders. So let's just say laws were not an issue. Would it even be possible for that to happen? Because there's other things at play here, right?
Well, it's an interesting question because what often happens is when a government is in decline, you have these ideological forces become even stronger because these are the real believers who are trying to save the regime, right? So in the case of the U.S., you always have U.S. officials, U.S. presidents especially, who will like appeal to Christianity and cultural conservatism. But in many cases, I think a lot of these leaders use it kind of cynically. They don't really believe in it. Certainly Trump. This guy doesn't believe in anything religious. He was asked in an interview, what's his favorite part of the Bible? He's like, oh, I like all of it. Old Testament, New Testament, I like them both. But certainly Trump. But when you have an empire in decline, a regime in decline like in the US, you start getting these very extreme forces who previously would have been totally fringe and not allowed anywhere near power, and they start taking over. It's also happening in Israel, by the way, which used to be, it was always very racist against the Palestinians, but it used to be much more secular, and it's become much more overtly religious and theocratic. So I would not be surprised to see something happen in the US. Certainly the Republicans have become much more open about this. You have some Congress people, like famously Marjorie Taylor Greene, said, I'm a Christian nationalist, and the US should be a Christian national, not just a Christian nation, a Christian nationalist nation. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more of that. In terms of your questions, which are very interesting, first on like whether China will be kind of forced to, how should I frame it? I guess, yeah, use more sticks. I don't think so. I agree with Arnaud because it's also, one, it's just a deep part of the ideology of the People's Republic coming out of the century of humiliation. Like China was a victim of 100 years of foreign intervention, partial colonization, subjugation, and then also like anti-hegemony has been a key principle throughout all of the eras of the PRC under all of the leadership, throughout the reform and opening up. Throughout, it's always been anti-hegemony, and as you know, like when China normalized relations with the U.S. and even with Japan, which committed, genocide and horrible crimes in China, China insisted on an anti-hegemony clause in all of those agreements. So this is obviously a deeply committed principle. At the same time, I think that China will find ways to support partners, but not directly. China has not fought a war since 1979. I don't expect it to do that anytime soon. But at the same time, there's been all these people saying, like, why hasn't China supported Iran and Venezuela? Well, how do we know that they haven't been supporting Iran and Venezuela? I'm sure they have been, but China they're not going to send troops. They don't do that. And it's because, again, they also want to provide some kind of alternative model. So, but at the same time, we've seen, like in the case of Iran and these recent, very violent protests, Iran has this new technology like blocking Starlink and stuff. We don't know where it came from, but people have speculated. So, I think that China is providing support for its partners in other ways. Certainly in the case of Venezuela, I know China has provided a lot of support. For instance, when the US put these very aggressive sanctions in violation of international law on Venezuela, China was like, okay, we don't care about US sanctions. We'll buy all of your oil that you were sending to the US. China provided a lot of support for the oil industry because so much of the infrastructure in Venezuela was built with technology from US companies. China it's a major oil producer, even though it's a net importer. So China provided a lot of support for modernizing, repairing the oil infrastructure. For your other question, it's a very interesting question, but even if China wanted, there's no way the US would allow that because, yeah, it's true. Israel provides a lot of, campaign contributions, and also the Gulf monarchies do as well. And if you look at, the US has something called FARA, the Foreign Agent Registrations Act, and there are so many politicians who, after they leave office, they become registered foreign lobbyists for Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain. It's very common. So I don't doubt that the US would allow that for allies, but for China, there's no way. And I have no doubt that as geopolitical tensions heat up, there are going to be laws passed to make sure that China cannot do that. But they'll make many exceptions for other countries.
Yeah. We'll see if we got any other questions, and we can circle back afterwards if you have some follow-ups as well. Thank you. Yeah.
I think it's very important not to overlook other factors or other regional powers in our discussion of a multipolar world. For example, Arnaud, you travel from Malaysia. Maybe you can talk about how this power struggle between U.S. and China complicates the regional power, like ASEAN countries. Yeah.
Great question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think we actually had a recent example in Malaysia because Trump came to Malaysia and they signed an agreement where, in particular, when it comes to tech, is actually quite unequal because, the agreement says that they need to notify the US first if they want to do any other tech agreement with China, basically, because it's let's not kid ourselves, it's about China. And so many people were commenting that Malaysia was moving on the US side and so on. But then a couple of weeks after, China announced its list of countries that are friends with the friendly countries for the Global Governance Initiative. I think it was 30 countries also. And Malaysia was part of it. And I think this is very representative of the of what ASEAN wants. They don't want to choose. They just want to have good relationships with both sides. And so they will always try to find a way to have to be like that. And there used to be an exception with the Philippines, which obviously had a lot of tensions with China. But even the Philippines are moving to a more balanced relationship with China. They just, for instance, opened visa-free tourism to Chinese visitors in order to develop links between the both countries, which is it's not a hostile move at all. It's the contrary. They want to improve relations with China. And so on the Philippines, by the way, is a good test case because it was much more on the US side. It's one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. I don't know if it's a direct result, but at least it's an interesting coincidence. So it's not economically beneficial when you're a neighbor of China to cut yourself from China, right? That makes sense. So I think most countries not only in ASEAN, but in the world, don't want to have to choose. And those who do choose, like we're seeing with Europe right now, when you put all your eggs in one basket, especially the US basket, then you're actually more victim of potential threats because you're totally dependent on them. So it's not a good strategy. You do want to be balanced so that if there is one pole that goes against you, you always have the possibility to hedge that with other poles. That's the key difference between the multipolar world and the bipolar world. The bipolar world, you had to make a choice. You couldn't. It was difficult to be in one camp or the other. In the multipolar world, you should not make a choice. It's the contrary almost.
And Ben, outside of, and you can add your own comments as well, but I'm curious, outside of Latin America, to effect this question, in Latin America, outside of the countries that are politically aligned with the US, are you seeing a similar kind of thing where these countries don't want to choose, or is the fact that they are a target of the US pushing them where they're actively choosing even China? Like, how's the situation similar or different there?
Well, there's no question that countries that are being targeted by the US with sanctions and other aggressive measures are often very clearly aligning themselves with China and Russia and BRICS more generally, BRICS being this kind of larger symbol of a global South movement seeking a kind of different global order. Now, it's a very interesting question, especially for ASEAN, because ASEAN is now the largest trading partner of China as a bloc, because I mentioned that we're seeing a slow economic decoupling of direct economic interchange between the US and China. There will still always be indirect trade. So for instance, critics point out that yes, China's exports to the US are falling as a share of overall exports and vice versa, but a lot of that's being rerouted through Southeast Asia, right? Which is good for Southeast Asia because then you can add more value to the production process. It creates jobs locally. So I think ASEAN is playing this very smart role in this larger conflict of trying to maintain good relations with both sides. And within ASEAN, there are countries that lean more pro-US and more pro-China, like the Philippines, more pro-US, and maybe like, for instance, like Cambodia, more pro-China. But what's interesting is there are recent polls done in the past 2 years of people in ASEAN, and 2 years ago, for the first time ever, a slight majority of people in ASEAN countries, not government officials, people said that if they were forced to pick a side, they would pick China. And this is largely because of the horrific crimes in Gaza, sponsored by the US. So you saw in the Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia especially, you saw a big shift toward China. Now, other regions of the world, they're not in that kind of same position. So like obviously Latin America is being very aggressively threatened, and I think economically they'll continue a lot of trade, but politically, unfortunately, they're going to be forced at gunpoint to ally more closely with the US. Africa is very interesting because if you read the National Security Strategy, it's a 32, 33-page document, and half a page is dedicated to Africa, which is crazy because Africa is it's very soon going to be by far the most populous continent.
Yeah, which by the way is good news for them probably.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the fact that the US is not really prioritizing Africa is a good thing. And of course, China and most African countries have very good relations. If you look at public opinion, in almost every single African country, the majority of the population has a positive view of China. So I think this is definitely an area of the world where the US is not going to have success in trying to cut them off from China. And the reason I mentioned, I stressed heavily that it is useful, I think, to say we're in a new Cold War because it's Washington that's driving it. So it's important to keep that framework because, that's what they're saying. China doesn't want it. But at the same time, it can be a bit misleading to emphasize the Cold War element. I won't say his name, but I spoke with a very influential professor of international relations at Tsinghua, and he said that he prefers the term Second Cold War as opposed to New Cold War, because if you say New Cold War, it sounds like it's similar to the first, and he emphasized that obviously the Second World War was very different from the First World War, and he emphasized that there are so many differences, and I agree with that. And one major difference, again, is that China, I think, is in a much stronger position than the Soviet Union was, and the US is in a much weaker position now. But another thing that's, I think, misunderstood about the First Cold War is that most of the world did not want to be aligned. That's why they founded the non-aligned movement in 1961. And that part is so often left out, is that the vast majority of the population in Africa, Asia, not so much Latin America, and even some parts of Europe were non-aligned. Yugoslavia was one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement. Ghana was a co-founder. Egypt was a co-founder. So I think today it's no surprise that most of the world is not aligned. I think one big difference today, which is an advantage also for China, is that back in the First Cold War in the 60s, the countries in the non-aligned movement economically were much less developed. Egypt, Indonesia under Sukarno before the US-backed coup, like Indonesia was one of the co-founders. Look at Indonesia then compared to today. Indonesia has developed very rapidly. It's one of the largest countries by population. So I think this is also a big shift, is that if you look back 60 years ago, those countries were not nearly as influential in the global economy. The fact that these non-aligned countries today are so much more economically developed and so much more populous, they have such bigger populations, I think is another example why this is going to be very different and why the US will not be successful in bullying these countries to just pick a side.
Well, thank you very much. So far, it's really doesn't feel it has been gone this many hours. Feel like 10 minutes of intense knowledge. My question is, as we were talking about ASEAN and Latin Americans and Africa countries, they want to be non-aligned, they don't want to choose sides, right? But on Chinese border, we have two. One is a country, one is a province that clearly choose or prefer to choose the American sides. What will their position be as this second Cold War happens, or the coexistence, or the American shifting back to their own territory rather than for them West Pacific, for us east of our China Sea? So what's your opinion on this, please?
I mean, on Taiwan, I think that the medium term, let's say, trend favors some kind of reunification. I mean, you listen to what the KMT is saying these days. It's quite extraordinary. And it looks like so far they are in a strong position politically to to win. And, if I listen to a lot of voices on Taiwan, and, most smart people that I listen to say that sooner rather than later, Taiwan is going to have to negotiate some form of deal with China because its relative position is weakening. And the US is bit by bit, is going to withdraw. It's starting to do that. If you look at the language in the latest national security strategy, there is a lot of conditionality on Taiwan. They mention even the possibility of losing conflict with China unless others step up and so on. So you can see that the US are hedging a bit. So Taiwan at some point needs to make a choice. And I guess the other country that you are mentioning is Japan, I imagine. And I think that what we are seeing in Japan, so what the Prime Minister said, is actually a symptom of US withdrawal or strategic retreat. Because when the US is withdrawing, you have the need to step up yourself, and you need to justify it in front of your population with more hawkish rhetoric. It's sort of political 101, which is what we're seeing in Europe as well. Like the US is retreating bit by bit, and so they're very, very hawkish in their rhetoric against Russia, because otherwise people will be like, why are we spending so much on weaponry? So I think it should be taken in that context. Obviously, there is a lot of history with Japan, and so when they sound more and more militaristic, it's pretty scary for the region. But you will note, I couldn't identify a single country in Asia that backed what she said. I mean, Taiwan obviously does, but it's not a country. Of course they would. But apart from that, I couldn't see anyone who backed them. Even Singapore, they didn't back them. And even the US didn't back them, right? You had that call between President Xi and Trump, where he asked Trump to call the Japanese Prime Minister to sort of tell her to tone it down, and Trump did. So it's I don't think we should be too worried. Is my point, because there is no one with Japan on this question.
Did you want to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, Arnaud made really good points. In terms of the changes we've seen in Taiwan, it's very interesting because obviously, according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. And if you look at polls in Taiwan, you see that the vast majority of people do not want independence. The vast majority of people want the status quo to remain. But the question is, what does that mean? So the polls always say status quo. Almost the vast majority say status quo. The status quo is changing. And I think over time, you'll see much more trade and not just economic interchange, but people-to-people interchange across the Taiwan Strait from the mainland. So over time, it's just inevitable that these forces will bring toward more reunification. And the changes we've seen in the KMT have been absolutely huge. And let's keep in mind that in the past elections, people keep acting like the DPP is so popular. But really what we've seen is that the electorate is really divided in three groups. And they got just enough to win, but they're not popular. Like the DPP has support of around 1/3 of the population. So I think the population of Taiwan province is pretty divided, and most people just want over time, they want more interchange to increase and kind of gradual reunification. In terms of, you talk about Japan pretty well. In terms of other parts of ASEAN, I think it's really interesting to see also how, as the US has been really pushing for more aggressive measures, and we've seen, conflicts in like Cambodia and Thailand and other places, what's interesting is that a kind of continuity throughout this process is that almost none of the countries in ASEAN have taken an anti-China position except the Philippines. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure even leaders that lean more pro-US, ASEAN has really made it clear that they do not want to be part of this larger conflict. So this gets back to this whole non-alignment. Japan and South Korea obviously are pretty unique. I think South Korea now, what's interesting is I thought, certainly under Yoon Suk-yeol, we saw a very firm anti-China position. I think South Korea is in a difficult position now where because it's so close to the US, it's militarily occupied by the US, they can't be seen as too pro-China. But we've seen a lot of kind of more like softer measures recently that show that like South Korea is definitely more interested in improving relations with China. And especially as the US, Trump talks about more kind of strategic withdrawal, that could be good for a place like South Korea, so it can have more non-aligned relations. The danger is Japan filling that. And what is really concerning to me, which you didn't mention, is that we now see more and more people in Japan talking about getting nuclear weapons, which I think is a very big problem in the upcoming decades. As the US, prioritize more like these kind of imperial sphere of influence approaches, if Japan, like the US has already kind of given a green light to Japan to remilitarize in recent years. We saw that under Shinzo Abe, there were these, crazy attempts to rehabilitate the Japanese empire and erase history. So that's what really concerns me is I think Japan is more and more serious about getting nuclear weapons. And if they do that, I think it's going to lead to a lot of nuclear proliferation. Iran is now, if you look at what's happening in Iran on all the US attacks, the only logical conclusion, if you're in Tehran, you can make is we have to be like North Korea. So that's a world I don't want to see, but I think it's looking more likely.
Right, yeah. We are going a little bit over time, but you have the mic, Diego, so I'll let you ask one more question.
All right, yeah, and finally, maybe I wanted to get a bit more specific and push you guys a little bit on this. I wanted to ask about Latin America again, if that's okay. And my assessment of Latin America right now is that it's very much kind of like the EU, like it's kind of fallen behind in terms of like, it's really too dependent on the United States. And if it tried to pivot to even be for itself, right, like you were talking about, like de Gaulle, I think even that would be met strongly against the United States. And so I'm wondering what you guys think of that assessment, and if it would be at all possible for Latin America to come together, right? And this is like a long, like centuries-long kind of idea, right? Going back to Bolivar and stuff. So would that ever be possible, even if we're looking at decades ahead?
Ben, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I hope that would be the great dream, right? But it's very difficult. So in the early 2000s, there was a very serious attempt at trying to bring about this larger dream of, Nuestra America, as they said, when they created the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, Nuestra America. And we saw, let's not forget that this coincided with the pink tide. You had left-wing governments in most of the countries in the region. In Argentina, you had the Kirchners. In Ecuador, you had Correa. In Brazil, you had Lula and Dilma. In Chile, you had Bachelet. Mexico was unfortunately the exception. Mexico often goes in the opposite direction. Now you have a left-wing government while the region's going right again. But what's interesting is you had the creation of the ALBA, you had the creation of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. So the kind of peak of this Bolivarian vision was the early 2000s, and it was met with very brutal force by the US. Many coup attempts, many sanctions, it was a very difficult period. What I will point out is that one of the advantages in that period that helped to encourage this unity is very high commodity prices. And China actually plays a role in this because, unfortunately, as I talked about, Latin American countries, when they deindustrialized in the neoliberal era, they became very dependent on a commodity supercycle. So when global commodity prices are very high, Latin American countries boom. When the commodity supercycle falls into the trough, Latin American economies go into crisis. This is what happened. Oil prices were very high. Other commodities, iron ore, agricultural goods, they were very high, which is good for global South countries and bad for the advanced countries in the core. So when oil prices collapsed in 2014, it was devastating and kind of the end of a lot of that in Latin America. But one of the main reasons for the high commodity prices is China was developing so rapidly in the 2000s, double-digit GDP growth, just importing everything. Like China, which is building out in 40 years. Let's not forget. At the beginning of the reform and opening up in 1978, 80% of people in China lived in rural areas, and now it's over 60%, like around almost 70% living in urban areas. Massive historic shift. So that kind of commodity boom, Latin America really benefited from that. So now what we're seeing is this kind of counter response where in Latin America, it's kind of a low point of that regional unity. So unfortunately, it's hard to see that. But I think that if we're talking like 50 years from now, if the US is much weaker, definitely, we could see a moment where, Brazil is a major economy. Mexico is a major economy as well. When you measure GDP purchasing power parity, Mexico is in the top 10 largest economies on earth. So there's a lot of potential there, but politically, it's just really difficult.
Right. Okay. Well, that was really good. I will end on a final question to ask a little bit of a prediction. I'll ask both of you, where do you hope we will be, zooming out, where do you hope we will be in 5 years? What will the world look like in 5 years? And where do you think we will actually be if those two are indeed different things? Arnaud, I'll start with you.
I started my speech with the sentence, great changes unseen in a century. I actually think we're seeing great changes unseen in 3 centuries, because I think that what we're witnessing is something that started during the Industrial Revolution, where the West started to have a big a technological advantage versus the rest of the world, and it allowed the West to dominate the world during like 3 centuries. And we're seeing the end of that, a world where finally you have non-Western, civilizations like China being peers again with the West. And I think this is a very deep trend, centuries long. So I think it's very structured. That's not going to change. And one thing that people don't focus on too much, but which I think will be a consequence of this, that we will see more and more, and certainly in 5 years, to your question, is when you are so much more powerful than someone else, you don't need to understand them, because you can just submit them. You can just say, my way or the highway, basically. Like you have just so much more power. But when you are that much more powerful, what you need to do is to understand them, because you need to convince them. You cannot anymore dictate what they need to do. And so if there is, I always like to end on a word of optimism. I think what we're likely to see more and more is more and more people trying to genuinely understand China, because in a multipolar world, you cannot anymore dictate what others do. You need to understand and to convince them. And so we're moving towards a world where people understand each other better because they need to.
So in this case, your hope and your prediction are both kind of in line with each other.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
And Ben, how about you?
Okay, what do I hope will happen? I hope Arnaud's right. I think, one of the main conclusions I've kind of come to today is we agree on pretty much everything and most things, but I think it's also kind of just a difference in disposition. I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I would say I'm realistic. I think most pessimists would say they're realistic. It's not like I want things to be bad, but studying history and looking at the balance of forces, I'm very concerned about the upcoming decades. I hate to end on that dark note. I just think there's going to be a lot of geopolitical conflict and a lot of violence and instability. So I hope you're right about that. But in 5 years, what do I think? I think we're going to see a continuation of the trend we've seen in the past 5 years, which is more fragmentation, more protectionism. I think we're going to see more conflict. And I think we're going to see basically this attempt, of course, China is opposed to it, but this attempt by the US, because it's so powerful, this attempt by the US to undermine the very foundation of international law, despite all of the problems that exist with that system, like the UN-centered system of international law, I think the US is really going to be waging full frontal war against it, which is going to lead to basically a US attempt to bring back a return to the law of the jungle, which is a very dangerous moment in history. I'm not saying that that's going to happen immediately in the next 5 years, but it's a larger trend we're moving toward. And in that world, I think China plays a very positive role in trying to encourage more diplomacy, peaceful trade, peaceful coexistence. But unfortunately, I just don't really see the conditions for that being guaranteed.
Right. Well, I guess time will tell. I think that's a
It's a dark note to end on, I'm sorry.
Let's do
but-
another one in 5 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. Everybody will hope that both of your hopes are true rather than your prediction. But we will see what happens. And I hope that that was very informative for everybody and they have a better idea of what is unfolding in front of our eyes, or at least has you asking the right questions and looking for the right signs to better navigate, once again, what's unfolding in front of our eyes. I thank everybody for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thanks again. Thanks, guys. That was great. Yeah. All right.